To continue on density-dependent factors and their effect on population numbers and density of individuals in populations, let's consider here, with the increased density of nesting females of a particular bird species, with more individuals, the number of resources available for those individual females declines because of competition, intraspecific competition. And that's competition between members of the same species. Where's my cursor? Here we go. So with increased competition due to increased density, what happens is the available resources are limited, and that's indicated by this declining number of offspring for each female. Okay, so increasing density results in fewer offspring for this particular bird species. So that's a density-dependent factor in the sense of food, resources, those sorts of things that the females need in order to produce viable offspring. Over here, kelp type of fish, kelp perch density, as their numbers increase, notice the line goes up, and the line represents numbers versus proportional death rate. So, as the density of this particular fish, this perch, increases, their death rate goes up. Why? Probably most likely because the loss of habitat. Places where the perch can hide and avoid predation. Okay? So that's a density-dependent factor. Loss of habitat due to increasing individuals. So, a limiting resource may be something other than food. It could be water, just a food-like resource, but it's not food, okay? Space to breed. Okay? So, example, the perch hides from predators in the kelp beds. Numbers of nesting sites for oceanic birds, like the gannets. So the oceanic birds require nesting sites on islands. So if the density increases, the number of nesting sites becomes definitely a limiting factor. Other density-dependent factors could be things like competition for resources. Actually, we've been talking about that. The more individuals you have, in this case spotted hyenas, the food resources may start to become limited or limiting. We talked about nesting habitat for birds, increasing disease transmission with crowding. The more individuals you get and the closer they are, the more likelihood you can transmit disease. Just consider COVID-19 right now. Or accumulation of waste materials, waste products. With more and more individuals crammed into each other, they have to defecate, poop somewhere. So the more of them that there are crammed together, the higher the incidence of dealing with toxic waste materials. The higher the incidences of disease transmission among individuals, right? The bigger competition for resources becomes. And all those things can be harmful and result in decreased density numbers. Now let's look at density-independent factors. These are factors that limit population sizes, or population size that is not related to actual density of a population. So these are often chance events. Changes in the weather. Okay, sudden hailstorm, for example, snow that would wipe out a number of individuals, had nothing to do with how many individuals were there, had to do with a density-independent event. Fire, floods, storms, avalanche, right? Earthquakes. Things that can limit population numbers that are totally independent of the actual number of individuals, hence density-independent factors. Over the long term, most populations are regulated by a complex interaction of density-dependent and density-independent factors. Some can become more important at certain times in the year or season. Others can become more important at other times. It depends on the environment, the habitat, the resources the organisms need, and the organism's life strategies or life histories as well. So let's look at population cycles and how population numbers change over time, or how they may change over time. So some populations of insects or birds and mammals undergo dramatic fluctuations, where the populations can rise somewhat rapidly, can decline, rise, and decline. Sometimes it's called boom or bust. So booms are exponential growth, followed by busts, population declines or diebacks, back to a minimal level, and back and forth. This is seen often with organisms that reproduce rapidly, tend to be short-lived, or with organisms that live in places where they're associated with, say, severe winters. Populations increase in the spring and summer, and they die back in the fall and winter as food becomes limited in the winter, and then the harsh weather as well. Or organisms that are closely associated with predators, as we'll see in a few minutes here. So examples of boom or bust cycles include things like lemmings, which can have exponential growth, and then their numbers die back dramatically because of limiting resources, increased predation, disease, other factors. Snow hares, type of wild rabbit, and a lynx, wild cat. They are in a close predator-prey relationship, and their numbers fluctuate together, as we'll see. So the lynx and the hare, their cycles are caused by winter food shortages, overgrazing, so that causes a decline in the hare numbers, in addition to predation by the lynx. The lynx numbers are associated with how many hares are available. So when there's an increase in the snow hare population in the spring and summer, that leads to a delayed increase in the lynx population because they have ample food. As the lynx population numbers increase, that increases predation pressures on the snow hares, so more of them die. And then in the winter, food is limited for the hares, and they get a further dieback, and their numbers drop. And then with the delay, the lynx numbers drop as well because their primary food source, or one of them, is becoming limited. Then when there's a decrease in predation pressure, the hares can bounce back in numbers. Spring and summer, more individuals are born. And then with the delay, the lynx numbers can then also increase because now they have more food to consume, and back and forth. So their population numbers cycle together, and the population numbers can be really tight and associated with each other when the predator and prey are very closely associated with each other. In other words, if there's a prey species that has one primary predator, and the predator has one primary prey species, they can cycle together closely like this. So let's look at applications of the science of population ecology. So humans have converted much of the planet and its natural ecosystems to artificial ecosystems in a way that produce goods and services for our benefit. If you've ever been on a plane and you're flying over the land, it's either cities, agriculture, or places where agriculture is not really possible, like deserts or mountains. But the humans have really altered the planet to a great extent. So, knowledge of population ecology, the science of population ecology, is used to increase populations of organisms we wish to harvest. Think of like corn or soybeans, apples, whatever it might happen to be, and to decrease population of pests, hopefully through natural strategies as opposed to just say pesticide, but we'll talk about that. But also to save populations of organisms that might be threatened by extinction, usually due to habitat destruction or alteration by human activity. So let's talk about conservation of endangered species. So in the United States, we have the Endangered Species Act. So an endangered species is a species that is in danger of extinction throughout or through a significant portion of its range. So like the sea otters on the Pacific coast, American bald eagle, wolves, the manatee that's around in Florida. These at one point or another were all endangered species. And a threatened species is a species that's likely to become endangered in the foreseeable future. So again, two categories of species at risk. The otters and the eagles and the wolves and the manatees, their numbers have bounced back quite a bit through conservation efforts. So the challenge for conservationists is to determine the specific circumstances that threaten a species or species and then try to figure out how to remedy the situation. So usually we find out what damage has been done due to the fact that some populations of organisms have got to the threatened or endangered levels after the fact. Okay, so through studying the population dynamics of the organism and their biology, whether it's a plant or an animal, conservation biologists can try to remedy the situation and replant trees and or plants, remove invasive species that are non-native that are damaging, and plant native plants. Maybe breeding programs to help endangered populations of organisms like the sage grouse, which numbers are actually increasing due to conservation efforts. So that's good. There's a lot of work to be done, of course. So, for example, the red cockaded woodpecker, right here. It's a species of bird that's threatened, and it requires a nice, mature, longleaf pine forest in order for it to make its nests and to raise its young. It has been threatened. Its numbers have declined because of logging. It's lost some of its native natural pine forested areas. And then also suppressing of fires has caused a increased undergrowth of shrubs and other trees in its native range, and that's limited its natural habitat, and it's also led to a decline in its numbers. Well, through conservation study, they've been able to figure out how to help mitigate the damage to help this species of bird bounce back. So wildlife managers have been able to protect some of their habitat and also have maintenance programs that help limit the amount of undergrowth by having controlled fires to reduce the density of the undergrowth so that the bird habitat has been reestablished in certain ways. Many forested areas have naturally occurring and somewhat frequent wildfire that helps maintain the amount of undergrowth. So these are management strategies that are important. So as an overall result, populations of woodpeckers, their numbers are recovering in some of their native ranges. So let's move on to invasive species. So what is it, or what are they? They're non-native species that have caused economic and or environmental harm by being introduced to a new area and colonizing and establishing themselves and sometimes dominating in a particular area by chance in a way, and by dominating, they've outcompeted many of the native species and in a way have altered habitat to the detriment of native species. So the harm they do is actually very extensive, not just to native species and to ecosystems, but economic. So in the U.S., there are hundreds of invasive species. Not all of them are known, but numbers of different plants, animals, mammals, fishes, arthropods, and mollusks that have been introduced that cause, as an estimate, and this is low, about $137 billion per year because of the harm they do to native habitats and to native species. So one of the reasons a introduced non-native species can become invasive is because it happens to appear or be introduced into a habitat